I was on the freeway and here comes somebody speeding and all of a sudden he just swerves around my car. It's like he's right there, like a moment stop. And he has this horrible big grin and he's missing all these teeth. He just stared at me.
Got us a serial killer.
There was no doubt about it. This was a pretty sick individual.
The so-called Night Stalker who has terrorized California.
The same man is suspected in 6 to 8 murders and 25 to 30 attacks.
I've committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and last but not least,
I saw somebody who was complete evil.
Today, we're going to explore 3 chilling true crime cases involving serial offenders.
Let's begin with the first case.
On the morning of August 8th, 1973, a 17-year-old boy called the police and told them he had just ended a man's life, gave them the address, and then sat down on the curb outside to wait. When officers walked into that house in Pasadena, Texas, they found remains of an individual in the hallway, a room covered in plastic sheeting with a board and restraints laid across it, and a teenager sitting calmly outside who told them, almost as an afterthought, that there was a storage facility nearby with remains concealed inside it. Nobody believed him at first, because nothing about what he was saying seemed possible for one man to have done in a quiet neighborhood over 3 years. Then they opened the door to stall number 11. This is the story of Dean Arnold Call, the Candyman. Dean Arnold Call was born on Christmas Eve of 1939 in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and grew up in a household where his father Arnold was strict and cold and openly admitted later that he had not particularly wanted children, directing his frustration at Dean and his younger brother Stanley through harsh treatment for even minor infractions, while their mother Mary worked hard to protect her boys and shield them from their father's behavior as best she could. The home was not a warm one by any account, and the contrast between a father who resented his responsibilities and a mother who devoted herself entirely to compensating for that resentment created an environment that was emotionally unstable in ways that shaped both boys in lasting ways. Arnold and Mary divorced in 1942 when Dean was just 3 years old, and the separation brought with it a period of constant movement as Mary tried to rebuild a life for herself and her children, with limited resources and no permanent base. After several years of moving around, Mary eventually settled the family in Vida, Texas, where she met and married a traveling salesman named Jake West, and where she and Jake opened a small candy manufacturing operation out of their garage that Dean and his brother worked in whenever they were not at school, learning from a very young age that work was the structure around which daily life was organized, and that contributing to the family enterprise was simply part of what belonging to this family meant. Dean was a quiet and reserved child who had no real friendships and spent almost all of his time either in school or working for the family. And when he was 7 years old, he developed rheumatic fever that went undiagnosed and untreated for 4 years and left him with a permanent heart condition and unable to participate in physical education classes, which pushed him further to the outside of school life at exactly the age when most children are forming their social identities. While other boys his age were building friendships through sport and physical activity and the ordinary rough and tumble of childhood, Dean was on the sidelines, watching from a distance, and the isolation that resulted from those years did not resolve as he grew older, but instead became the baseline condition of his existence. By the time he reached adolescence, he had never fully learned how to connect with other people in the ordinary reciprocal way that most children develop without thinking about it, and had instead become skilled at operating on the margins of social groups without ever truly being part of them. In 1958, the family relocated to Houston's Heights neighborhood and opened a new candy shop positioned directly across from an elementary school. And this is where something significant changed for Dean, because he discovered for the first time that he had a particular ease around children and teenagers that he had never had around adults, and that young people responded to his attention and his generosity in ways that made him feel accepted and valued in a way that nothing in his previous experience had produced. He was often outside the shop offering candy to children as they walked past after class, and had set up a pool table in the back room where kids could come in and hang out after school. And he gave away free samples and helped neighbors with their cars, and was generally regarded as generous and kind and good with young people. And the nickname, the Candyman, followed him naturally from those years and stayed with him everywhere he went afterward. After a period spent living with relatives in Indiana, Dean came back to Houston to help run the family business, and was eventually given the title of Vice President of Operations. And during this time, a teenage employee made a complaint about Dean's conduct toward him, and Mary responded by terminating the employee and setting the matter aside entirely without any further investigation, which represents the first documented instance of a warning being raised and then deliberately ignored by the person best positioned to take it seriously. In 1964, Dean was drafted into the Army, but served less than a year before successfully applying for a hardship discharge on the grounds that the family business needed him, and he returned to Houston in 1965 and went back to running the candy operation until 1968, when the business closed after his mother moved to Colorado, and Dean chose to stay behind in Houston, finding work as an electrician at the Houston Lighting and Power Company and settling into his own apartment in the Heights for the first time in his life entirely alone and without the structure that the family business and his mother's presence had imposed on his daily existence. One of the detectives who worked the case years later said that he believed Dean had spent years trying to be the person his mother wanted him to be, and that something came loose in him once she was gone, and there was no longer anything holding it in place. And while that explanation does not fully account for everything that followed, what happened in the years after Dean moved into that apartment represents one of the most prolonged and devastating failures of community and institutional awareness in American criminal history. One of the first young people Dean had drawn close to through the candy shop was a boy named David Brooks, who had started visiting the shop when he was about 12 years old, and who was regularly made fun of by other children because of his appearance and his manner, and Dean treated him with a respect and consistency that nobody else in David's life had managed to offer, giving him money and letting him ride his motorcycle, and spending time with him in a way that communicated that David was genuinely valued rather than simply tolerated. For a boy who had grown up feeling invisible and dismissed by the people around him, that kind of consistent attention from an adult was extraordinarily powerful, and David came to see Dean as something resembling the father figure he had never really had, and kept visiting him even after the candy shop closed, and Dean moved to his own apartment in the Heights. What Dean was doing during this period was not accidental. He was identifying in David exactly the qualities that made a person useful to him: the deep need for approval, the absence of other meaningful adult relationships, and the willingness to accept almost any terms in exchange for continued access to someone who made him feel significant. And he was cultivating those qualities carefully over a period of years before he ever made any direct demand of David at all. Dean used this closeness to gradually pull David further into his world, and one evening, David arrived at the apartment without warning and walked in on a scene that made the nature of what Dean was doing completely clear, confronting him with a reality that changed everything about the relationship from that moment forward. Dean responded not with panic, but with an immediate and calculated offer, telling David that he would give him money and a car if he stayed quiet, and helped him find more young men to bring to the apartment, promising $200 for every person David could deliver. And David accepted the offer because Dean was the most important person in his life, and because Dean had made it quietly understood that there would be serious consequences for anyone who stopped cooperating. Dean had worked out a careful system for what happened once a person arrived at the apartment, which involved making them comfortable with drinks and substances over the course of an evening, and then presenting what he framed as a game involving restraints, in which Dean would appear to lock himself in and then escape while secretly keeping a key hidden. And then he would invite the other person to try it, and once they were immobilized and unable to leave, the situation changed completely and irreversibly. The restraint setup that Detective Mulliken had found in the bedroom on the morning of August 8th was central to everything that happened in that apartment across 3 years, and David later told investigators that once someone was placed on that board, the outcome was never in any doubt. Dean rented stall number 11 at the Southwest Boat Storage Facility in South Houston, specifically to manage what accumulated from his activities at the apartment, using lime and plastic sheeting to conceal what was hidden beneath the floor of the stall. And the facility manager later described him to investigators as a quiet and polite tenant who visited several times a week, paid on time, never caused any difficulty, and had recently asked about renting a second unit, which in the context of what investigators found inside stall number 11, when they finally opened the door, carries a weight that is very difficult to put into words. In late 1971, David Brooks introduced Dean to a 15-year-old from the Heights named Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., who went by Wayne and who was sharp and streetwise in the way that teenagers from difficult homes often are, having grown up in a household shaped by a father who had been physically harmful toward the whole family before the marriage ended, and having dropped out of school entirely in order to help support his mother financially after his parents divorced and his father was out of the picture. Wayne was the kind of teenager who had been forced to grow up faster than most people his age, because the circumstances of his life had not given him the option of doing anything else, and he carried himself with a confidence and a street-level awareness that made him seem older than 15, and that Dean recognized and understood how to use from the very first time they met. When Wayne met Dean through David, he later described the experience as meeting the most capable and present adult he had ever spent real time with, someone who actually listened to him and engaged with what he said and explained things to him as if his perspective genuinely mattered. And Dean came over to fix his mother's car and sat at the Easter dinner table and charmed the whole family effortlessly. And Wayne's mother thought Dean was a perfectly nice man and had no concern whatsoever about her son spending time with him, because nothing about Dean's presentation gave her any reason to think otherwise. This was, of course, exactly the effect Dean had worked for years to produce, and he produced it in the Henley household as naturally and completely as he had produced it everywhere else in the Heights. Dean told Wayne gradually and carefully that he was connected to an organization based in California that worked with young men and placed them with clients, framing the whole arrangement in terms that made it sound almost like a business opportunity rather than anything that should raise concern. And he offered Wayne the same financial deal he had given David: $200 for every person Wayne could bring to the apartment, and sometimes as much as $1,500 for individuals who were more difficult to locate. And Wayne initially did not fully understand what was actually happening to the people he brought over, because Dean was deliberate and careful about what he revealed to Wayne, and when he revealed it, sharing information only in the amounts that served his purposes and no more. But the reality became clear to Wayne over time, and the understanding of what he had become part of settled over him gradually, rather than arriving all at once. And by the time he fully understood it, he was already so deep inside the arrangement that the options available to him had narrowed to almost nothing. He did not go to the police because Dean had made it openly and directly known that Wayne's younger brothers were of specific interest to him, and that if Wayne ever stopped cooperating or attempted to leave or tried to create distance between himself and Dean in any meaningful way, those brothers would not be protected from what Dean could do, which meant that Wayne was effectively locked into the arrangement not by money or by any loyalty to Dean, but by the one thing he valued more than his own safety, which was the safety of his family. Together, Dean and David and Wayne operated as a system across 1971, 1972, and into 1973, with Wayne making contact with boys from the Heights neighborhood who had no reason to be suspicious of an invitation to come hang out and spend time with people they knew, because the invitation always came from someone familiar, and the setting always seemed ordinary and social and unthreatening. Many of the people Wayne brought over were his own friends and classmates and neighbors, because those were simply the young men he had the most access to and the easiest ability to approach without raising suspicion. And the weight of that fact that Wayne was delivering people he actually knew and cared about is one of the most difficult elements of this case to sit with. He had helped Dorothy Hilligeist and her husband put up the missing posters for their son David across the Heights neighborhood, while knowing exactly what had happened to David Hilligeist, and that detail, more than almost any other in the entire case, captures the specific psychological trap that Wayne was living inside during those years, the way in which he was forced to perform normalcy and concern and community solidarity in public, while carrying a private knowledge that had no outlet and no resolution. By 1973, Dean had grown noticeably less stable, and Wayne later described him as becoming visibly agitated and restless when too much time passed between incidents, making small involuntary movements and expressing to Wayne with increasing urgency that he needed someone new, and the frequency of what was happening accelerated sharply between June and August of that year, as Dean acted with less patience and less caution than he had shown in the years before. Wayne had attempted to create some distance between himself and Dean by trying to enlist in the Navy, which would have taken him physically out of Houston and out of Dean's reach, but he had been rejected because he lacked a high school diploma, and every other avenue he had mentally explored led back to the same conclusion, which was that there was no clean way out, and that the only thing standing between his brothers and what Dean had threatened was his continued cooperation with a man he had come to genuinely and deeply fear. On the night of August 7th, going into the early morning of August 8th, Wayne brought two friends with him to Dean's house in Pasadena, where Dean had recently moved. One of them was a 15-year-old girl named Rhonda Williams, who had been close with Wayne, and who came that evening with no understanding whatsoever of what Dean Call actually was, or what his house had been used for. And the other was a 19-year-old named Tim Curley, who had grown up in the same streets as Wayne, and who was described by people who knew him as easygoing and genuinely well-liked by everyone around him. Both of them walked into that house the same way dozens of young people before them had, trusting the person who had arranged the evening and expecting nothing more than a social night with people they knew. Dean was visibly angry when he saw that Wayne had brought a girl, because he had told Wayne repeatedly and explicitly never to do that. But Wayne managed to calm him down enough that the four of them settled in for the night, and what followed was several hours of drinking and inhaling paint fumes until somewhere around 5 in the morning, when all three teenagers became unresponsive, which was not unusual in the context of how these evenings had typically gone, except that this time something was different in the way Dean was moving around the room when Wayne started coming back to awareness. Wayne was the first to regain consciousness, and he found himself on the floor in restraints with Rhonda, and Tim already held nearby and unable to speak, and Dean was moving around the room with a deliberateness that made clear he had already decided how the night was going to end for everyone in it. He told Wayne that he had ruined everything by bringing a girl, and that Wayne was now going to participate in whatever Dean decided to do next, whether he wanted to or not. And for a moment, Wayne later described as the longest of his life. He assessed everything in the room, the position of the people in it, what was within reach, and what his only real option actually was. Wayne kept his composure and told Dean that he would cooperate with whatever was asked, but that he needed his hands free to be of any use, and Dean considered that for a moment and then unlocked the restraints, and the moment Wayne's hands were free, he reached for the weapon and picked it up and raised it and told Dean that it was over. Dean walked toward him slowly and said calmly and almost with amusement that Wayne would not go through with it, apparently genuinely convinced that the 17-year-old in front of him would back down the same way he always had before. And that miscalculation was the last one Dean Call ever made. The confrontation continued until Dean collapsed in the hallway and did not move again. Wayne went immediately to Rhonda and Tim and freed them from their restraints, and the three of them walked outside together and sat on the curb in the early morning light. And Wayne picked up the phone and called the police and gave them the address and waited. Rhonda Williams and Tim Curley were alive because of the decision Wayne had made in that room, and both of them would go on to give accounts to investigators that confirmed everything Wayne had described. When Detective Mullikin arrived and worked through the full account of that morning, the self-defense case was solid, but it was what Wayne said next about the storage shed and the names of missing boys that transformed a single overnight confrontation into one of the most significant criminal investigations in American history. The first set of remains was recovered about 6 inches below the surface of the stall floor, carefully concealed beneath a layer of white lime. And as Mullikin and the officers continued working through the stall systematically, they made a second discovery and then a third and then more beneath those, with some having been there for months and others appearing to have been there for considerably longer, and some found at different depths in the same section of ground. By midnight on August 8th, 8 sets of remains had been removed from the stall and transported to the county medical examiner, and the search was not finished. The next morning, Wayne led investigators north to a wooded area near Lake Sam Rayburn, about 150 miles from Houston, and he directed them exactly where to stop along a dirt road and told them where to search, and 4 more were found there. The day after that, he and David Brooks, who had walked into Houston Investigator that morning with his father and given a full written statement about his own involvement in everything, led police to a third location at a beach community called High Island, about 80 miles south of Houston, where 6 more recovery sites were identified along the sand. The final confirmed number was 27 young men, most of them from the Heights neighborhood, many of them known to each other, several of them known personally to Wayne and David, and the recovery process involved identifying them through dental records and personal items found near them, because DNA technology, as it exists today, was not available in 1973, and the medical examiner's office worked around the clock going through the physical evidence that families provided. David Brooks gave his full account at the Houston Death Investigation offices in a flat and almost emotionless tone that investigators described as deeply unsettling, going through the events chronologically and describing how the restraint system was used, how the van was used to transport remains to the concealment locations, and naming additional individuals that Wayne had not yet mentioned. The shock that moved through the Heights when the story broke on the evening news of August 8th and 9th was unlike anything the neighborhood had experienced, because the missing boys were not strangers to the people hearing the news, but were classmates and neighbors and brothers of people they saw every day, and the realization that Dean Call had been the one taking them, while the whole community trusted him and vouched for him and invited him to family dinners, was almost too large to process. People who had known Dean personally, who had accepted candy from him and let their children spend afternoons at the shop, and described him to others as one of the good ones in the neighborhood, were now sitting in front of their televisions, trying to reconcile what they were hearing with the person they believed they had known. that reconciliation was not possible, and many of them said afterward that they were never fully able to make sense of it, that the two versions of the man simply could not exist inside the same mind at the same time. The neighborhood itself went quiet in a way that people who lived there during those days have described consistently ever since. Parents who had let their teenagers come and go freely because the Heights had always felt safe suddenly found themselves unable to offer that same freedom. The ordinary rhythms of the community were disrupted in a way that took years to recover from, and in some respects never did. Dorothy Hilligeist, who had spent more than 2 years distributing posters and hiring private investigators and pursuing every possible lead for her son David, learned through a media report that remains were being recovered from a storage shed in South Houston, and waited for the call that came confirming that David had been one of the first identified after more than 2 years. The family of Frank Aguirre learned that Frank, who had been missing since 1972, was among those recovered, and Frank's mother Josephine, who had been lighting candles every single day in the hope that her son would come home, received the news from a reporter who knocked on her door, and she broke down completely. Neither of these families had stopped searching. Neither had accepted the explanations that officials had offered them. Both had been right to keep looking, and both now had to absorb the truth of what had been found. Several families learned the news not from any official notification, but from journalists who arrived at their doors before investigators did, which added the indignity of having private grief become public before the family had any time to be alone with it. The father of Donald and Jerry Waldrop, a man named Everett, who had lost both of his sons and had gone to the police station so frequently and with such determination that he later said he had been there about as often as the chief himself, had specifically told police years earlier that he had heard a rumor about a man named Dean Call hiding victims at a local storage facility, and police had conducted what they described as a brief search and concluded it was not credible. Both of Everett's sons were found in stall number 11. Everett Waldrop spent the rest of his life carrying the knowledge that he had been right, and that being right had not been enough to save them, and the distance between those two facts is one of the most painful things in this entire case. He was not the only parent who had brought specific and actionable information to the police and been turned away. A mother had written down a license plate number connected to Dean Call and submitted it. A father had described a conversation his son had reported having with a man who matched Dean's description. Each time, the information was received, logged somewhere, and not followed through on. The collective weight of those missed moments is something that investigators who came to the case later have spoken about with visible discomfort, because the pattern is so clear in retrospect and so impossible to undo. The Houston police chief held a press conference in response to the wave of public criticism and stated that the young men had been runaways and that their parents bore some responsibility for not keeping better track of them. And the mayor of the city supported this position publicly, and the response from the families was immediate and furious, because these were boys who had packed for vacations they were about to take and left their spending money on their dresses and had never once run away before in their lives. And the Vatican's newspaper and the Soviet press both published editorials about what had happened in Houston and the failures of the institutions that were supposed to prevent it. The suggestion that these families had failed their children was received as an insult layered on top of an unbearable loss, and several parents spoke publicly in the days that followed with a directness and a composure that under the circumstances was remarkable, making clear that they had done everything asked of them and had been failed at every institutional turn. In 1974, David Brooks pleaded guilty to one count in connection with the case of teenager Billy Ray Lawrence on the strength of his own confession and his acknowledged presence at multiple scenes, and his trial lasted less than a week before he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison in March of 1975, showing no expression during the sentencing, while his wife wept in the gallery behind him. David Brooks died in prison in May of 2020 after contracting a serious illness, having served 45 years. He had been 17 when he first became involved with Dean Cool, and the question of how much of what he did was the product of genuine choice versus years of manipulation from the age of 12 is one that legal proceedings were not designed to answer, and that was never fully addressed. Wayne Henley's trial was moved to San Antonio because finding an impartial jury anywhere in Houston was considered impossible given the scale of coverage the case had received, and after a proceeding that drew comparisons to other high-profile trials of the era, Wayne was convicted on 6 counts and sentenced on July 16, 1974, to 6 consecutive 99-year terms totaling 594 years, and he later successfully appealed on a procedural ground and was retried in 1979 and convicted again with the identical sentence. Those who have spoken with him at length have noted that he carries the weight of what he was involved in without deflection, though the legal system has never drawn a distinction between his circumstances and those of a person who acted without coercion. Both men applied for parole repeatedly over the following decades, and each application required the families of the young men to submit statements and relive the details of what had happened to their sons and brothers, which meant that families who had already been through an unimaginable loss were periodically asked to go through the formal process of describing that loss again in writing for a parole board. And James and Elaine Dreymala were still attending those hearings for Wayne Henley into the 2000s, more than 4 decades after their son went missing. The process of attending those hearings, of sitting in a room and reading a statement about what the loss of a child had meant to a family across 50 years, is a demand that the legal system places on grieving families in a way that is rarely discussed. And the Dreimalas and others who have shown up year after year to those proceedings represent a form of endurance that deserves to be acknowledged plainly. The official count of 27 has always felt incomplete to the investigators and journalists who spent the most time studying the case, because there are gaps in the timeline that have never been satisfactorily explained, including a period of almost 6 months between August 1971 and February 1972, with no confirmed activity, and a 4-month gap in early 1973, and investigators who reviewed the records noted that from the years between 1968 and 1970, approximately 42 boys fitting the profile of Dean's known cases were flagged as potential additional cases that may never be officially connected. The number 27 is the number the legal record settled on, but it has always been understood by those closest to the investigation as a floor rather than a ceiling, a minimum rather than a complete accounting. And that distinction matters to the families of boys from the Heights whose sons disappeared during those years and were never found. The family of Mark Scott spent years uncertain whether the remains given to them by the medical examiner's office actually belonged to their son, and DNA testing eventually confirmed that their instinct was correct and that the remains they had been given were those of a different individual entirely named Stephen Sickman, who had been missing since July of 1972, and Mark Scott's actual remains were believed to be at High Island until Hurricane Ike moved through Texas in 2008 and destroyed a significant section of that beach, after which investigators believed those remains were carried out to sea permanently. Mark's mother had kept a single fragment back from what she had been given, something telling her to hold on to at least one piece just in case. And when the DNA results came back, that instinct proved to have been correct. But by then, finding what actually belonged to her son was no longer possible. That story of a mother who held something back because she could not fully trust what she had been told, and who turned out to be right, says something about what these families had learned to expect from the systems around them. As of this recording, at least one of Dean Cool's cases remains completely unidentified, and Dr. Sharon Derrick at the Harris County Medical Examiner's Office has spent years working to restore names to those who lost theirs. and since 2006, she has successfully identified 5 additional individuals using advances in DNA comparison technology. But one still waits. That work, done quietly over nearly 2 decades, does not undo what was not done then, but it means at least one family may yet receive the confirmation they have been waiting for. Dean Caul was never questioned by investigators, never sat in a courtroom, and took everything that only he fully understood with him when he collapsed in that hallway on August 8, 1973, which means that everything the public knows about what happened came secondhand through 2 teenagers who were trying simultaneously to tell enough of the truth to close cases and hold back enough to limit their own legal exposure, and the full picture of what Dean Caul did and to how many people has never and will never be completely established. There are details about specific cases and individuals whose names have never appeared in any record that exist, only in whatever Dean Caul carried with him, and that information is gone. Homer Garcia's parents visited their son's resting place every Sunday for nearly 4 decades, and his headstone carries the words, "The day they took you. Part of us went with you." And Frank Aguirre's mother, Josephine, developed memory loss in her later years, and her daughter said privately that part of her hoped the illness had taken with it the worst of what her mother had been carrying. But whenever someone said Frank's name near her, she would begin to cry, regardless of what else she had forgotten. Jimmy Glass's mother never recovered from learning what had happened to her son, and eventually required psychiatric care. And Dorothy Hilliges died at 88 years old in the same Heights neighborhood where she had raised David, and the priest at her funeral called her a woman of sorrows who had also done a great deal of good in her life. And both of those things were completely true. These were not people who moved on. These were people who continued to live, which is a different thing entirely. The Heights today has higher property values and a different demographic, and no physical markers anywhere commemorating the 27 boys taken from its streets. And some younger residents say they have never heard the name Dean Caul at all. And that is worth sitting with because his confirmed case count exceeds those of John Wayne Gacy and Ted Bundy combined, yet his name is almost entirely unknown outside of Houston. The absence of that recognition is not simply a trivia gap. It reflects something about which stories a culture chooses to carry forward and which ones it allows to fade. And the stories that fade tend to be the ones involving communities and individuals who were already overlooked by the systems that were supposed to protect them. The parents who went to the police year after year were sent home every time. The father who sat in that waiting room for 8 months was turned away every single time. And the mother who wrote down a license plate belonging to Dean Caul's vehicle and took it to the police had her information set aside without follow-up. And what might have happened differently if anyone in a position of authority had taken any one of those moments seriously is something the families of 27 young men have lived with for more than 50 years. That question has no satisfying answer, but the fact that it still needs to be asked is exactly why this story continues to matter. This is one of the most significant cases in American criminal history, and the vast majority of people have never heard of it. If stories that deserve more attention than they ever received are what you are looking for, you are in exactly the right place. Subscribe and come back every week because there are dozens more cases just like this one waiting to be told properly. Every name in every story here matters, and none of them should be forgotten.
Now let's move on to the second disturbing true crime story.
Carl Eugene Watts was born on November 7, 1953, in Colleen, Texas. His father, Richard, was a private in the United States Army. His mother, Dorothy, was the kind of warm and creative person who taught children how to paint and make things with their hands. From the outside, they looked like a perfectly normal family, and for the first 2 years of Carl's life, nothing about them stood out. Then his parents split up. Dorothy packed what she could, took Carl, and headed north to Inkster, Michigan, a working-class suburb just outside Detroit. She got a steady job as a high school art teacher and did her best to raise Carl and his younger sister Sharon on her own. She was a hard-working single mother doing everything she could to keep the family together. Eventually, she met and married a mechanic named Norman Caesar. Norman already had 6 children from a previous relationship, and together, he and Dorothy would have 2 more kids of their own. Almost overnight, that quiet little home became a house with 2 adults and 10 children under one roof. For Carl, that kind of environment was overwhelming. He was already the quiet type, a boy who kept to himself and had a hard time opening up. Getting lost in a household that big only made things worse. His sister Sharon later described him as extremely withdrawn and shy. She was clear that there was no abuse happening in the house, no mistreatment from either their mother or their stepfather. But something about Carl was different, and everyone around him could feel it, even if they could not explain it. The thing his sister noticed most was how Carl handled his emotions. He never let anything out. He would bottle things up for a long time, stay calm on the surface, and then when everything finally spilled over, it came out all at once and in a big way. It was like a pressure cooker with no release valve. Nobody knew just how dangerous that pattern would become. When Carl was 8 years old, something happened that his family would spend the rest of their lives pointing to as the turning point. He got meningitis. Meningitis is a serious infection that attacks the thin layer of tissue surrounding the brain and spinal cord. In the early 1960s, it was not well understood and was often deadly. Carl's case was severe. His fever climbed so high that doctors were genuinely worried about permanent brain damage. He had to go through repeated spinal taps, which are painful procedures where a needle is inserted into the spine to remove fluid. He was kept completely isolated for weeks because of how contagious and serious the illness was. His sister Sharon got meningitis around the same time and bounced back fairly quickly. Carl did not. On top of the meningitis, doctors discovered he had also developed polio during the same period. Between the 2 illnesses, Carl missed nearly his entire 3rd grade year of school. When he finally came home from the hospital, his family immediately noticed something was wrong. The talkative, energetic boy they had known before was simply gone. In his place was a child who seemed distant and disconnected, slower, quieter, like a part of him had stayed behind in that hospital and never came back. His school performance collapsed. He struggled to focus on anything for long, and he often complained that he could not remember things the way he used to. He eventually had to repeat a grade, which made school feel even more frustrating and humiliating for him. Around this same time, something else started happening inside Carl's head, something that nobody in his family knew about until years later when investigators began piecing together who he really was. Carl started having recurring dreams, but these were not ordinary nightmares. In his dreams, he was fighting women. Not women as real people, but women as dark and threatening forces. He described them to doctors as evil spirits that he had to battle. In his mind, they were not human. They were something wicked that needed to be destroyed. The strangest part was how these dreams made him feel when he woke up. Most children who have violent or frightening nightmares wake up scared. Carl did not. He told doctors that after these dreams, he felt calm, better, lighter, like something that had been pressing down on him had finally been lifted. The dreams did not go away as he got older. By the time he was 12, they had started bleeding into his waking hours. He began thinking about the dreams while he was awake, replaying them in his head during the day. Around this same time, he started following girls around his neighborhood. He would watch them from a distance, track their routines, and think about what he would do if he ever got one of them alone. He did this quietly and carefully for the next 3 years. Nobody noticed. Nobody stopped him. On June 25th, 1969, 15-year-old Carl was doing his paper route in Inkster when he knocked on the door of Joan Garve, a woman who was one of his regular customers. When she opened the door, he attacked her without any warning at all. He physically attacked her. And then, just as suddenly as the attack had started, it stopped. He turned around, walked back to his bicycle, and continued delivering newspapers as if absolutely nothing had happened. Joan called the police right away. Officers showed up at the Watts home 4 days later and took Carl in for questioning. When they asked him why he had attacked her, he did not offer a complicated explanation. He just shrugged and said he felt like beating someone up. That was it. That was the whole reason. Carl was sent to the Lafayette Clinic Psychiatric Hospital in Detroit for a full evaluation. The doctors there found a 15-year-old boy with an IQ of 75, which placed him just barely above the level that was officially classified as intellectual disability at the time. He showed clear signs of disordered thinking. He told the doctors about the dreams, about the evil women, about how the violence in those dreams made him feel peaceful when he woke up. One psychiatrist summed up his findings in language that left no room for interpretation. Carl was a paranoid young man who was struggling to control powerful and dangerous impulses toward violence. The doctor wrote that his ability to control his own behavior was seriously flawed, and that the risk of him acting out violently again was very high. He described Carl plainly as a serious threat to society. And then, on Carl's 16th birthday, they released him. They sent him home with instructions to attend outpatient therapy sessions. Between 1969 and 1974, Carl went back to that clinic for outpatient treatment, fewer than 10 times total. He was barely going. Nobody followed up. Nobody pushed. The system had done its evaluation, written its warning, and moved on. Despite everything, Carl managed to graduate from high school in 1973. His grades were not good, and everyone around him knew he had been using drugs. But he was genuinely talented at sports, good enough to earn a football scholarship to Lane College in Jackson, Tennessee. He lasted exactly 3 months. Multiple women on the Lane College campus reported that Carl had been following and approaching them in ways that frightened them. The school eventually removed him, and to make things even more alarming, a female student at Lane College was found stabbed to death that same year. Many people on campus believed Carl was responsible, but there was no physical evidence to bring charges against him. He walked away clean. He came back to Michigan and enrolled at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo in the fall of 1974. He worked in the campus cafeteria. He lived in student housing. On the outside, he looked like any other young man trying to make something of himself. But the freedom of living on his own gave him too much time to think, and thinking always led him back to the same dark place. On October 25th, 1974, a Western Michigan University student named Lenore Nazaki heard a knock at her apartment door. She was cautious enough to answer it with the chain still attached. The man standing on the other side told her he was looking for someone named Charles. She told him no one by that name lived there. He was persistent and kept standing there. So to be polite and end the conversation, she offered to grab a piece of paper so he could leave a note for this Charles person. The moment she unhooked the chain to get the paper, he lunged through the door. He got both hands around her throat and cut off her breathing until she lost consciousness. Then, just like he had done with Joan Gave 5 years earlier, he walked away and left her there on the floor. She survived because he chose to stop. 5 days later, he came back to the same apartment complex. This time he knocked on a different door. 20-year-old Gloria Steele was home getting ready, and she did not survive. She was found fatally attacked with a sharp object. The tip of the tool had broken off during the attack and was lodged in her spine. Her windpipe was also crushed. Nothing had been taken from her apartment. She had not been harmed in any other way. The attack was nothing but pure, focused rage. On November 12th, a 23-year-old woman named Diane Williams, who worked as an apartment manager in a nearby complex, noticed a man wandering around asking for someone named Charles. Eventually, he ended up at her door. She offered him paper to leave a note, just as Lenore had done. The moment she turned to get it, he forced his way inside and began attacking her. Diane fought hard. In the middle of the struggle, her phone started ringing, and she managed to knock the receiver off the hook. She screamed as loud as she could. The person calling was her husband's secretary, who immediately heard the screams and called 911. That scared Carl off. As he left, Diane watched through the window and saw him get into a tan Pontiac Grand Prix. She gave police the car description. Officers put together a lineup of 8 men who matched the physical description and drove that specific vehicle. Both Diane and Lenore were able to identify Carl without hesitation. He was arrested and charged with the 2 assaults. During questioning, he admitted to attacking roughly 15 other women in the past. He denied having anything to do with Gloria Steele's death. Before his trial, Carl was evaluated again at the Center for Forensic Psychiatry in Ann Arbor. That doctor came to the same conclusion as the one before him. Carl was competent to stand trial and was clearly dangerous. The likelihood that he would reoffend was very high. Carl pleaded no contest to both assault charges and received a 1-year sentence in county jail. 1 year for 2 strangulation attacks and a very likely connection to a murder. He was out in 1976. When Carl got out of jail, he moved back in with his mother and stepfather in Inkster. He met a woman named Dolores Howard, who became pregnant with his child. He barely acknowledged the baby as his and made no effort to support her at all. About 6 months after the birth, he married someone else entirely. He had met a woman named Valeria Goodwill at a disco club in 1979, and they got married in August of that year. Valeria quickly realized something was deeply off about her new husband. He rearranged the furniture in their home compulsively, moving things around over and over for no clear reason. He would take knives and hack apart their houseplants. He melted candles directly onto the table and left the mess there. He would scatter trash across the floor and just leave it sitting there for days. She also noticed that after they were intimate, he would leave the house for hours. He would disappear late at night and not come back until early in the morning. She had no idea where he was going. What she did not know was that Carl was breaking into the homes of women in their neighborhood during those nighttime disappearances. Victims would wake up to find a man standing in their bedroom. It was dark enough that none of them could positively identify who it was. The marriage lasted less than a year. Valeria left, and Carl stopped pretending to hold back. On October 8, 1979, 22-year-old Peggy Pocket was found strangled to death in the front yard of a home in the neighborhood. 3 weeks later, on October 31st, 44-year-old John Klein was walking home from a doctor's appointment in the quiet, well-off suburb of Grosse Pointe Farms when someone attacked her on the sidewalk and fatally wounded her with a sharp tool. She died right there in the street. Because it was Halloween, people walking past her body during the evening assumed she was a gory decoration. Police had absolutely no leads. By early 1980, Carl had moved to Ann Arbor, and the pace of the violence increased sharply. On April 20th, 17-year-old Shirley Small was stabbed twice directly in the heart, found just outside her home. On July 13th, 26-year-old Glenda Richmond was stabbed 28 times outside her apartment. On September 14th, 20-year-old Rebecca Huff, a graduate student at the University of Michigan, was found outside her apartment complex with extensive injuries. All 3 attacks happened in the early morning hours. All 3 women were found just steps from their own front doors. Nothing was stolen. There was no other apparent reason behind any of it. Just sudden, overwhelming violence, and then silence. Investigators could no longer ignore the pattern. The local newspaper gave the attacker a name, the Sunday Morning Slasher, because several of the attacks had occurred on Sunday mornings. Police formed a dedicated task force led by Detective Paul Bunton, but they were working with almost nothing to go on. There were no witnesses to the actual attacks, no useful physical evidence left behind, and no clear motive that might point them toward a specific person. The victims were different ages, different races, different backgrounds. The only things they had in common were that they were women, and they were attacked at the same hour of the morning. Then Bunton received a call from a detective who had worked the Kalamazoo assault cases back in 1974. The details matched too closely to ignore. Bunton started digging into Carl Watts. In October of 1980, police in Windsor, Ontario reached out to investigators in Michigan. Women in Windsor, just across the river from Detroit, had been attacked in a pattern that looked almost identical. Most had survived, but just barely. Bunton pulled Carl's vehicle records and discovered that his car had crossed into Windsor multiple times, and that nearly every time it did, an attack followed shortly after. One survivor, a woman named Mary Angus, looked at a photo lineup and picked Carl out. She said she could not be 100% certain, but she picked him. Then, on November 15th, 1980, two patrol officers in Ann Arbor spotted a brown Pontiac Grand Prix crawling slowly through a neighborhood street, following a female student who was walking home alone. She noticed the car, grew concerned, and ducked into an apartment building. The officers pulled the car over. The driver had an expired license and outdated plates. It was Carl Watts. When they searched the vehicle, they found screwdrivers and wood carving tools in the car. And then they found something that stopped everyone cold. A book with Rebecca Huff's name carved into the cover. Rebecca Huff, the graduate student who had been found with more than 50 stab wounds just weeks earlier. Carl asked for a lawyer the moment he realized what they had found. They did not have quite enough to charge him with murder, but he was now the primary suspect in a very active investigation. Police placed Carl under around-the-clock surveillance. They planted a tracking device in his car and followed him everywhere they could. What they observed was deeply troubling. Carl would drive hundreds of miles on a single night, circling neighborhood after neighborhood, moving slowly through streets, watching. He clearly sensed he was being followed, because the murders in Michigan stopped completely during the months the surveillance was active. In the spring of 1981, Carl quit his job and moved to Texas, looking to shake his observers and find a fresh start somewhere new. Detective Bunton immediately contacted the Houston Police Department and sent them everything he had. Carl's full criminal history, photographs, vehicle details, and a complete breakdown of the Michigan murders. He warned them clearly and directly. Carl Watts was a predator who needed to be watched very closely. Houston did very little with that information. To be fair, understanding what Houston was like in 1981 helps explain part of it. The city had the highest murder rate in the entire country at that time. The police department was completely overwhelmed, underfunded, and buried under an impossible number of active cases. Bunton's warning likely landed on a desk somewhere, got filed away, and sat there. Carl found work as a mechanic, settled in, and quietly started again. The attacks in Texas came fast and without pause. What Carl did between the fall of 1981 and the spring of 1982 represents one of the most relentless periods of violence in American criminal history. On September 5th, 1981, 22-year-old Linda Tilley was a student at the University of Texas in Austin. Carl spotted her in Houston and followed her car for the entire 160-mile drive back to her apartment. He followed her from the parking lot, grabbed her from behind when she was almost at her door, and after a violent struggle, both of them tumbled into the apartment complex's swimming pool. He forced her underwater, leading to death, then climbed out and drove all the way back to Houston. When her body was found the next day, she was fully clothed. There were no obvious signs of a struggle around the pool. A toxicology report showed she had been drinking, and her death was officially ruled an accidental drowning. 5 days later, 25-year-old Elizabeth Montgomery was out walking her dog near her Houston apartment when someone stabbed her in the chest. She managed to get back inside her building, but later died of her injuries. Less than 30 minutes later, and just a few miles away, 21-year-old Susan Wolfe was walking from her car to her apartment with groceries in her arms. Carl grabbed her and stabbed her 9 times in the chest. She died on the pavement right outside her front door. 2 women, same night, less than 30 minutes apart. In January of 1982, 27-year-old Phyllis Tam went out for her regular early morning jog around Rice University in Houston. She was seen running at about 6:15 in the morning. An hour and a half later, she was found deceased at the scene. She was fully clothed otherwise, wearing her jogging clothes. No signs of a struggle anywhere nearby. Police initially ruled it a self-inclined death. Her family refused to accept that. They convinced the medical examiner to take another look, and he eventually changed the cause of death. But even he could only say the evidence pointed to either a very unusual accident or a deliberate act carried out by someone else. Carl would later confirm that he had strangled her and staged the scene specifically to see what the police would do. That same month, 25-year-old Margaret Fossey was found dead in the trunk of her own car on the Rice University campus. She suffered severe neck injuries. Also in January, Carl came across a woman named Julia Sanchez as she was alone on the side of a highway trying to change a flat tire. He severely injured her neck and left her there. Somehow, she survived. On February 7th, 20-year-old Eleanor Samander was found strangled. Her body left in a trash bin near a bar she had visited earlier that evening. In March, 14-year-old Emily Lacqua disappeared while walking to her very first day at a new job at a restaurant. Her body was not found for 5 full months, hidden inside a drainage culvert along a roadway. On March 31st, 20-year-old Mary Castillo was found dead near a ditch. On April 15th, 21-year-old Yolanda Garcia was found fatally attacked in her own front yard, still holding the bag that contained her work shoes. The next day, 32-year-old Carrie Jefferson was fatally assaulted after finishing her shift at the downtown post office. Carl concealed her remains along a nearby bayou. On April 21st, 25-year-old Suzanne Searles was grabbed outside her apartment. He strangled her, but was not sure it had worked. To make certain she was gone, he pushed her head into a flower pot filled with water. The pace was extraordinary. Multiple victims in the same week, multiple victims on the same day. And through all of it, Carl left almost nothing behind. No fingerprints, no witnesses to the actual acts, no physical evidence connecting him to any of it. On the night of May 22nd, 20-year-old Michelle Madej had been out and was walking home to her apartment in Houston when Carl spotted her and followed her. As she approached her door, he came up behind her and grabbed her by the neck. He squeezed until she went completely limp. He used her keys to unlock her apartment, brought her inside and placed her in the bathtub. He plugged the drain and filled the tub with water. He told investigators later that he did this so her spirit could not escape. That was the reason he gave. The very next morning, May 23rd, he came back to the same apartment complex. 19-year-old Lori Lizzer had just gotten home from work and was walking from the parking area toward her building when Carl grabbed her from behind. He put both hands around her neck and choked her until she lost consciousness. He tucked her body under the staircase, took her keys, and walked upstairs to the apartment she had pointed toward before passing out. Inside the apartment, he found 18-year-old Melinda Aguilar getting ready for church. He grabbed her, told her he would hurt her badly if she made a sound, pushed her into the bedroom, and began attacking her. Melinda made a decision in that moment that saved her life. She went completely limp and played dead. Carl used a belt to tie her ankles together. He used a wire coat hanger to bind her wrists behind her back. Then he went back downstairs, dragged Lori upstairs, brought her into the bathroom, and began filling the bathtub with water. In the hallway, he clapped his hands together and actually jumped up and down, visibly excited and thrilled about what he thought he was about to do. While his attention was focused on the bathroom, Melinda worked quietly to free her hands. She managed to get loose, made her way to the sliding glass balcony door, opened it, and jumped from the second floor. She said later that if she was going to die, she would rather it happen on her own terms. She landed on the concrete below, and running entirely on adrenaline, got straight up and ran to a neighbor who was sitting outside. That neighbor called 911 immediately. 2 officers arrived within minutes. Carl had gone to check on Melinda, found the room empty, looked through the open balcony door, and saw the police cruisers parked below. He ran. He made it down the stairs and past the officers, but he could not outrun them. He hit a dead end and was caught. The man in handcuffs was Carl Eugene Watts, and as investigators sat with him in the interrogation room that day, they began to understand exactly how large and how long this had all been going on. Prosecutors had Carl on solid ground for the events of that one morning. He had been caught red-handed, but when they looked at the bigger picture, all the murders stretching back through Texas and Michigan, they ran into a serious problem. Carl had been incredibly careful throughout his entire career. He almost never left any physical evidence at the scenes. No fingerprints, no witnesses who could testify to seeing the actual acts, no DNA connecting him to the Houston murders. Prosecutors looked at what they had and made a decision that devastated everyone connected to this case. They offered Carl a deal. If Carl would confess to the unsolved death cases and help lead investigators to the locations of the bodies, the state of Texas would give him full immunity from prosecution for those killings. He would plead guilty to aggravated burglary and attempted murder for the May 23rd incident, and he would receive a 60-year sentence. The state of Michigan refused to participate in the agreement, meaning anything Carl confessed to in that state remained open for future prosecution. But Texas was locked in. None of the victims' families were consulted. None of the surviving victims were asked for their input. When the deal was announced publicly, the citizens of Houston were furious, but it was already done. Carl took the deal. Over the course of approximately 1 week, he sat with investigators and gave statement that 13 deaths were linked to him. He described each one in specific and disturbing detail. He explained what he did, how he did it, what tools he used in each case, and what he was thinking at the time. He showed absolutely no regret throughout the entire process. He led detectives to 3 separate recovery sites and showed them exactly where to dig. When investigators asked him why he had targeted women, Carl told them the women had evil in their eyes, just like the forces he fought against in his childhood dreams. He believed that by ending their lives, he was actually freeing their spirits from the darkness inside them. That was the explanation he held on to. He also kept hinting throughout the confession sessions that there were many more, far more than 13. At one point, he said 40. Then he said 80. Eventually, he stopped giving numbers altogether. Investigators who spent years studying his movements and the timelines of unsolved cases in the areas where he lived believed the real total could be well over 100 women. On September 3rd, 1982, Carl Eugene Watts was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Everyone involved believed that a 29-year-old man sentenced to 60 years would die behind bars. The math seemed simple enough. They were wrong. In 1989, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reviewed Carl's case and identified a legal error. When Carl had agreed to the plea deal, no one had properly informed him that the bathtub and the water he used in his attempt to drown Lori Lisa qualified as a deadly weapon under Texas law. Because of that oversight in the original proceedings, his conviction was officially reclassified from violent to non-violent. That change had enormous consequences. In Texas, offenders who are classified as non-violent are eligible to earn good time credits. For every single day they serve without incident, they receive 3 days removed from their remaining sentence. Carl behaved perfectly inside prison. He became a model inmate and accumulated good time credits at a steady and significant rate. The 60-year sentence quietly shrank year by year, piece by piece, without most people even noticing. By 2002, Carl Watts had a scheduled release date on the calendar, May 8th, 2006. He would walk out of prison at the age of 52, having served just 24 years after confessing to 13 murders and hinting at dozens upon dozens more. He was genuinely going to be a free man. When the news of Carl's upcoming release became public, prosecutors in Michigan went into emergency mode. The immunity Carl received through the Texas deal only covered the crimes he confessed to in Texas. It did not extend to Michigan at all. If Michigan investigators could tie Carl to even a single murder in their state, they could stop his release completely. A dedicated task force was assembled. Investigators pulled more than 200 unsolved cases from across Michigan and Canada, spanning multiple decades. They went through old files, half-forgotten reports, physical evidence that had been sitting in storage for years, and any lead that had ever been connected to Carl's name. They were looking for anything solid enough to hold up in a modern courtroom. Then, in early 2004, everything shifted because of a man watching television. Joseph Foy was sitting at home one evening when a news story came on about Carl Watts and his scheduled release. He called out to his wife immediately. That was him. He recognized that face. He was absolutely certain. On the night of December 1st, 1979, Joseph had been out on his back porch in Ferndale, Michigan, when he looked into the alley behind his house and saw a man attacking a woman. He watched as the man raised his hand and brought it down in a sharp, deliberate slashing motion. For just a moment, the attacker glanced up and his eyes met Joseph's. Joseph had called the police that very night. He had worked with a sketch artist to produce a likeness of what he saw, but the case had gone cold, time passed, and nearly 25 years went by. Now that memory, combined with everything investigators had gathered over the years, was finally enough to move forward. Carl was formally charged with the first-degree murder of 36-year-old Helen Dutcher, the woman who had been attacked in that Ferndale alley on the night Joseph witnessed it. Carl was convicted on November 17, 2004, and sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. 2 days after that verdict came down, prosecutors announced they were bringing a second murder charge against him, the 1974 killing of Gloria Steele, the Western Michigan University student who had been stabbed 33 times. In July of 2007, Carl was found guilty in that case as well. A second life sentence, no parole, no second chances. Justice finally, after more than 30 years. But it did not last very long. Just a few months after that second conviction, in September of 2007, Carl Eugene Watts died of prostate cancer in a hospital in Jackson, Michigan. He was 53 years old. Carl Eugene Watts never gave investigators the full picture. He confessed to what the deal required, hinted at far more than he ever admitted, and took the rest with him when he died. based on the patterns investigators have traced across Michigan, Texas, and Canada, based on the timelines of unsolved cases in every city Carl ever lived in, and based on his own contradictory and shifting confessions over the years, the real number of women he harmed in his lifetime may never be fully known. What is known is deeply troubling. Psychiatrists evaluated Carl at 15 years old and wrote in plain language that he was dangerous and certain to re-offend. He was released anyway. He attacked a woman at 15, strangled women at 21, and continued without meaningful interruption into his 30s. Every single time the system caught him, it found a way to work around the edges instead of dealing directly with the problem. A 1-year sentence in one place, a plea deal in another, a legal technicality that quietly turned 60 years into 24. The families of Carl's victims were left in an almost unbearable position. Many of them got confessions but no convictions. They knew what had happened to the people they loved. They knew who had done it. But legally, the case was closed. Immunity had been granted, and there was nothing more to be done. The surviving victims were never consulted when the deal was made. They were left to find out through the news like everyone else. And Carl Watts, a man who admitted to targeting women in repeated attacks because he believed they carried evil in their eyes, spent the better part of 3 decades cycling in and out of freedom before finally being stopped for good. He was caught red-handed on May 23, 1982. Even that was not enough on its own. It took a man named Joseph Foy, watching the evening news 25 years after looking into a dark alley, to finally close that door. Carl Eugene Watts had no motive that the rest of the world would recognize. No money, no personal hatred toward anyone specific. Nothing taken, nothing gained. He chose his targets based on something only he could see. A twisted belief that grew out of childhood nightmares and slowly consumed everything else. He was the very definition of someone the system had every warning it needed to stop, and kept failing to act on anyway. The most dangerous people in history are not always the most famous ones. Sometimes they are the ones nobody bothered to remember. If you want to keep exploring cases like Carl Watts, ones that fell through the cracks and nearly disappeared from history, hit subscribe and stay with us. There is always another story worth knowing, and we will be here every week to tell it.
Now let's move on to the third disturbing true crime story.
William Patterson comes home to a quiet house. The door is unlocked. He calls his wife Emily's name. No answer. He checks each room, searches the yard, knocks on a neighbor's door. Nobody has seen her since mid-morning. He goes back inside. He calls her name again. The house holds its silence. He kneels at the side of their bed and prays for her safe return. Then he notices something, a shape beneath the bed. He reaches down and pulls back the edge of the bedsheet. Emily Patterson is there. Found unresponsive, had suffered severe injuries, her remains hidden under the very bed she had made that morning. Investigators believed she had died earlier that day. Her wedding ring was gone. Her husband's suit was gone. The family Bible was gone. The man who had taken all of it had been watched by neighbors that same afternoon, calmly fixing the screen door of this house in plain sight, while Emily was still alive. He had knocked on her door that morning and offered to do repairs in exchange for a room. She had let him in because he seemed like exactly the kind of person you let in. That was all it took. And Emily Patterson was not his first. She was not his second. She was not even close to his last. By the time William Patterson found her beneath that bed, this man had already ended the lives of at least 21 other women across 2 countries, and not one of them had seen it coming either. The man responsible was Earl Leonard Nelson, who was born in San Francisco on May 12, 1897. His parents, Francis and James Ferrell, were both dying of syphilis, a disease that, left untreated in that era, destroyed the brain and body over years. Francis passed away when Earl was 9 months old. His father followed 6 months later. Earl was not yet 2 years old and had already lost everything a child depends on. He went to live with his maternal grandmother, Jenny Nelson, a devoted Pentecostal Christian who structured every day around religious discipline. The Bible was the center of the household. Passages from the book of Revelations were read aloud regularly. Sin, divine punishment, and the corruption of the world were not abstract ideas for young Earl. They were the vocabulary of daily life. He took his grandmother's surname. Earl Ferrell became Earl Nelson, the name that would eventually appear on wanted posters from California to Canada. Even before anything physically catastrophic happened to him, Earl Nelson stood apart. Teachers noticed it. Neighbors noticed it. Other children noticed it most clearly. He was withdrawn in a way that went beyond shyness. He held conversations with people who were not there. He quoted scripture in context that made no sense, hands trembling, eyes focused on something invisible. He was expelled from school at 7 for conduct that frightened his classmates. He developed an early habit of watching others without their knowledge and became absorbed in biblical passages about sin and punishment, a fixation that had a ready supply of material in the household where he was raised. His grandmother responded to these signs by intensifying the religious structure around him. More scripture reading, more time in church, more emphasis on separation from a sinful world. In her framework, the solution to a troubled child was more discipline and more faith. There is no record that anyone sought medical or psychological guidance for the boy. In 1904, those options were limited and largely unknown to families like his. He was simply managed within the household, surrounded by apocalyptic imagery and strict rules, with no outlet for whatever was building inside him. None of this, by itself, predicted exactly what followed, but it established the foundation. A boy with no parents, raised in severity and isolation, already experiencing something that separated him from ordinary reality, already drawn toward darkness in ways that other children were not. In 1907, Earl Nelson was showing off for neighborhood children, riding his bicycle as fast as he could manage, when he misjudged an intersection and rode directly into the path of a streetcar. The crash caused a severe head injury with long-term effects. Witnesses blocks away heard the collision. Doctors did not expect him to survive. He remained critically injured and unconscious for days. On the 6th day, he opened his eyes. The people around him quickly recognized that the child who woke up was not quite the same one who had ridden into that streetcar. Severe chronic headaches made him press his hands against his skull and cry out. His memory fractured unpredictably. His behavior became erratic in new ways. He walked on his hands through the house, lifted heavy objects with his teeth, left for school in clean clothes, and returned hours later in torn rags with no explanation. The voyeuristic tendencies and religious obsession that had already been present intensified into something consuming. His grandmother responded with the only tool she had: more scripture, more discipline, and it did not help. As Nelson moved through adolescence, the combination of his brain injury, his psychotic episodes, and his disordered thinking about women brought him repeatedly into contact with law enforcement. He was arrested for burglary at 18 and served time at San Quentin State Prison. Prison addressed nothing that was actually wrong with him. It paused him and then released him back into the city. In 1921, he entered a home on Pacific Avenue in San Francisco under false pretenses. Inside, he found a young girl alone. He attempted to attack her. Her screams brought her brother running, and Nelson fled. He was caught nearby. This time, instead of prison, he was committed to Napa State Hospital for the criminally insane. Doctors documented hallucinations, paranoid beliefs, and auditory disturbances. He believed people were trying to harm him through poison. He heard voices. He escaped from the facility once, was returned, and escaped again. In March 1925, Napa State Hospital formally discharged Earl Nelson in his absence. The administration had given up on holding him. A man with documented psychotic episodes, a history of violence toward women and children, and a skull fractured in childhood was released into San Francisco with no supervision, no follow-up plan, and no public warning. He was 27 years old. What happened in the 11 months between his discharge and the first confirmed crime is not well documented. What is known is that nothing interrupted the compulsions building inside him. By February 1926, those compulsions found an outlet, and once they did not stop for 16 months. The first known victim was Clara Newman, 60 years old, who ran a boarding house on Pier Street in San Francisco. She was respected in her neighborhood, financially stable, and proud of her establishment. When she placed a room for rent notice in a local paper in February 1926, she was doing something thousands of women across California did regularly. The man who appeared at her door introduced himself as Roger Wilson. He was clean, composed, and softly spoken. He carried a Bible. He asked reasonable questions. Clara Newman had no cause for concern. Within the hour, she had lost her life. Found dead, her jewelry taken, her body left in a vacant room of her own property. Police found no witnesses, no signs of forced entry, and no reason to connect this to anything beyond itself. They logged it as a robbery gone wrong and moved on. It was, in their understanding, a single incident. They had no way of knowing it was the first. 2 weeks later, Laura Beale, 63, posted a room for rent advertisement in San Jose. The man who arrived was still using the name Roger Wilson and carrying the same Bible. Investigators noted signs of fatal assault. He was gone before anyone came to check on her, and on a train before her body was found. He had been in San Francisco 2 weeks earlier. He was in San Jose now. He would be somewhere else entirely within days. No police department was in contact with another. No one was drawing any line between these two deaths. The 2 weeks between San Francisco and San Jose established the rhythm that would define the next 16 months. Nelson moved between cities on trains, used a different name in each place, and relied on the fact that each set of investigators was looking at what appeared to be a local incident. There was no mechanism for a detective in San Jose to know that a detective in San Francisco had recently documented a crime with the same method, the same victim profile, and the same description of the suspect. The isolation between jurisdictions was, for Earl Nelson, as effective as invisibility. Over the following months, the crimes continued moving through California, Santa Barbara, San Francisco again, Oakland. Each victim fit the same profile: a woman living alone or operating a boarding house who had advertised a room. Each had let in a polite stranger who gave her no reason for alarm. In San Francisco, Lillian St. Mary lost her life in June. Ollie Russell in Santa Barbara the same month. Each case was handled locally, each investigator looking at what appeared to be a standalone crime. The victims were women of modest means. Their cases were opened, documented, and left largely unsolved. In Oakland, the case of Mary Nisbet took a different turn. Her husband Stephen came home to find her missing. She was found dead in the bathroom. Investigators believed the case showed escalation. Oakland police arrested Stephen Nisbet. The logic was not unreasonable. Spouses are statistically the first persons of interest. They held him for 2 days. By the time they cleared him, Nelson was already in another state. The 2 days lost to the wrong arrest were 2 days. The real perpetrator used to increase his distance. Witnesses across multiple California cities were by mid-1926 independently describing the same figure in separate police reports. Stocky build, dark complexion, arms that seemed longer than normal, with hands that appeared disproportionately large and powerful. California newspapers assembled these descriptions into a profile and gave him a sensational nickname. It was not precise, but it captured something about the physicality witnesses described, and it followed Earl Nelson all the way to his trial. Isabel Gallegos was found in her Stockton home in August. She had advertised a room. The circumstances matched what investigators in San Francisco, San Jose, Oakland, and Santa Barbara had each documented independently. The cord, the missing valuables, the absence of forced entry, the description of a religious-seeming man seen near the property. Stockton police filed their report. No one yet had the channels, the authority, or the broader view to see that all of these reports described the same man. This was the central failure defining the entire 16-month span of Nelson's crimes. Each jurisdiction was a silo. Information moved slowly. Telegrams required someone to have already identified a connection before they could be sent. No one had identified the connection because no one had the full picture. Earl Nelson was benefiting from a gap in law enforcement that had never been tested on this scale before. By autumn, Nelson had moved north to Portland, Oregon. In the space of 3 days, 3 women lost their lives, and the way their bodies were concealed marked a clear shift in his behavior. Beata Withers, 35, was found by her 15-year-old son, was found concealed in the attic. The following day, Virginia Grant was located behind a furnace in a vacant nearby property. The day after that, Mabel Fluke was discovered in an attic crawl space. 3 deaths in 3 days was a concentration of crimes that California had not seen, even during Nelson's most active months. The hiding places were more elaborate and more deliberate than anything documented before. An attic trunk, a furnace cavity, a crawl space. Each required Nelson to spend time inside the property after the death, choosing the location, arranging the concealment, calculating how long it would take before the discovery. That kind of extended presence in the scene of a crime takes a certain quality of detachment that investigators found difficult to account for. The deliberate concealment was different from what investigators had seen in California. This was not panic. Nelson was choosing hiding places, taking time, making decisions about how long it would take for each body to be found. Some part of his mind, despite the psychotic breaks, was still calculating. Portland police issued public warnings. A coroner's jury spent time debating whether Beata Withers could have concealed herself in a locked trunk in her own attic. The debate was eventually resolved correctly, but the delay was real. While officials discussed the impossible, Nelson was already traveling south. From Portland, Nelson moved to Los Angeles briefly, then north to Seattle. Florence Monks was a wealthy widow with a room available. She lost her life and her jewelry the same afternoon. After her death, Nelson traveled back to Portland and checked into a boarding house under the name Adrian Harris. Before moving on, he gave gifts to his landlady and to a female tenant living in the same house. The gifts were pieces of jewelry, warm, apparently generous gestures from a man who seemed to enjoy making people feel valued. Police later confirmed those pieces had come directly from Florence Monks. The women who received them had held items taken from a dead woman and thanked him for his thoughtfulness. This behavior speaks to something important about how Nelson's mind was organized. In his own understanding, he was not a dangerous man. He was decent, generous, and religious. The complete separation between that self-image and the reality of what he was doing was not performance. It was how he genuinely experienced himself. That internal split was, in many ways, what made him so difficult to identify and so effective at gaining trust. On Thanksgiving Day, 1926, Blanche Myers was sitting down to a midday meal with a friend when someone knocked. Newspapers across the western United States had been running descriptions of the gorilla killer for months. The descriptions were detailed. Blanche Myers had read the papers. The man at her door was soft-spoken, unhurried, and offered $4 for a room. He seemed safe. She showed him the room and agreed to the arrangement. When she was found later that day, she was beneath the bed of the room she had just rented. Her engagement ring was gone. $8.50 had been taken from her purse. This time, police found something new. Fingerprints, clearly defined, lifted from the bedpost of the rented room. The first solid physical evidence that could be connected to a person, rather than simply a description. For the first time, investigators had something comparable against records. The problem was that by the time those prints were processed and circulated, Nelson was on a train heading east, putting new states between himself and San Francisco with every passing hour. By December 1926, 14 women had lost their lives. The crimes were accelerating. The new year brought no pause. In Council Bluffs, Iowa, Almira Bard lost her life in January 1927. She had been advertising a room. The details matched exactly what investigators had documented across California and Oregon. In Kansas City, Missouri, Bonnie Pace became the next victim. Nelson had now crossed multiple state lines. He was no longer a California problem or an Oregon problem. He was operating across the entire country, and the fractured structure of American law enforcement in 1927 had no mechanism to address that. Police departments in different states had no established protocols for comparing crimes that resembled each other. Investigators in Kansas City had no particular reason to connect Bonnie Pace's death to anything happening in Portland or San Francisco. Moving further east, Nelson appeared in Philadelphia and then Buffalo. In both cities, women who had advertised rooms lost their lives. The method was unchanged. The profile of the victims was unchanged. The interval between crimes was shrinking. Where earlier in 1926, there had been weeks between incidents, by early 1927, the gap was often less than 2 weeks, sometimes less than 1. In Philadelphia, Mary McConnell was found in her home in April 1927. She ran a boarding house. She had a room available. The circumstances required no additional elaboration for any investigator with access to the full pattern. But access to the full pattern was still not available to the officers working these individual cases. The compressing intervals were a signal that something inside Nelson was changing. The earlier crimes had been spaced apart enough to allow him to travel and settle briefly in each new city. As those intervals shortened, the careful quality of earlier crimes was giving way to something more reactive and less controlled. In Detroit, on June 1, 1927, the deterioration became unmistakable. 2 women, Fannie Mae and Geneva Forbes, were found in the same building on the same day, both harmed in the same way, within hours of each other. Investigators recovered evidence pointing to a distinctive method. The physical evidence at the scene matched the pattern under investigation. This was not careful planning. This was not methodical behavior. This was someone operating without the internal structure that had previously defined his approach. The building owner, Leonard Sink, discovered both victims when he arrived to collect rent. Police who responded had 2 victims, 1 location, and a perpetrator already gone. By this point, investigators across multiple states were finally beginning to compare notes and recognize they were looking at the same person. Descriptions were aligning, timelines were overlapping, a national profile was forming. But the man himself was already moving north toward the Canadian border, carrying his Bible, scanning newspapers for room for rent advertisements in cities where nobody knew his face. Earl Nelson crossed into Canada in the first week of June 1927 and hitchhiked into Winnipeg. His first stop was a second-hand clothing shop. where he traded his existing clothes for a laborer's outfit and received $1 in change. He then made his way to a boarding house on Smith Street, operated by Catherine Hill. He signed in as Mr. Woodcott's, paid $1 as a deposit, and promised to pay the remaining $3 by Friday. Catherine Hill found him pleasant and unremarkable. That same day, Nelson encountered 14-year-old Lola Cowan. Her father was recovering from serious illness and the family had no income. So Lola sold handmade paper flowers door to door to help support them. Nobody witnessed their first meeting. He persuaded her to return with him to his rented room. When investigator later found Lola Cowan in his room, the officers who responded, experienced investigators who had attended serious scenes before, were deeply affected by the scene. The case contained disturbing evidence. Investigators did not fully describe publicly. Lola Cowan, who was 14 years old, became one of the youngest victims in the case. She had been selling flowers to help her sick father. 2 days after Lola Cowan was taken, Nelson was on the same street and spotted a room for rent sign in the window of Emily Patterson's home. She was inside alone, cleaning. He knocked. He offered to carry out small repairs in exchange for lodging. Emily considered the offer. It seemed reasonable. A man willing to work for a room was not something to turn away lightly. Neighbors on the street watched him work on the screen door that morning. He was calm, steady, and unhurried. He worked with the quiet attention of a man simply doing what he had offered to do. Nothing alarmed anyone watching. From the outside, this was an entirely ordinary scene. Once certain Emily was alone, everything changed. She did not accept what was happening without resistance. There were signs she resisted. She left visible signs of resistance. Neighbors later learned that she tried to resist. He was stronger. He fatally attacked her. He took her wedding ring, her husband's suit, and the family Bible, then walked out, past the same neighbors who had watched him fix the door, and disappeared into the street. That evening, William Patterson came home to an empty, silent house, realized his wife had been dead, hidden in the room, and Winnipeg understood in a single moment what it was dealing with. 2 deaths in 2 days. The city mobilized. Winnipeg police moved with a speed and coordination that had been absent from the American investigations. A clothing dealer described a transaction on June 8th. A man matching the general description had traded garments for a laborer's outfit and $1. The dealer remembered him clearly. Stocky, dark complexion, arms that seemed longer than average, hands visibly large and powerful. A jeweler reported receiving pieces later confirmed to have come from victims in Seattle and Portland. Nelson had been carrying stolen property across state lines and international borders without apparent concern. Nicholas Tabor, a barber working in the city, provided the most detailed account. Nelson had come in for a shave and haircut in the days after Emily Patterson's death. Tabor noticed dried material matted in his head. When Tabor reached to clean the scratches, Nelson pulled back sharply and told him not to touch them. The reaction was disproportionate and memorable. 3 witnesses, 3 consistent descriptions. Descriptions went out to every station across Manitoba and into the surrounding provinces. Newspapers published them. For the first time in 16 months, the net had a shape that matched the man inside it. 8 days after Emily Patterson's death, on June 16, 1927, a constable in Killarney, Manitoba, stopped a man whose appearance matched the circulated descriptions. The man gave his name as Virgil Wilson, said he was a farmer passing through, and answered every question calmly and without hesitation. The constables came close to releasing him. Instead, they brought him to the local jail as a precaution. That night, Virgil Wilson slipped out of the jail and made his way to the nearest railway line. He boarded a freight train heading south toward the American border. The train was carrying Winnipeg police officers returning from the search. Nelson was on a train full of the people looking for him and did not know it. The following morning, a constable in Crystal City spotted him near a grain elevator. This time, there was no deliberation. He was taken directly to Rupert Street Police Station in Winnipeg. Investigators photographed him, fingerprinted him, documented his measurements, and sent everything to police departments across North America. San Francisco responded first. The prints matched records from Nelson's prior California arrests. His fingerprints also corresponded to evidence from multiple American crime scenes. Forensic evidence was presented linking him to multiple crime scenes. The scratches on his face aligned exactly with what Emily Patterson's resistance would have caused. When asked to write his name and date of birth, he wrote, Earl Nelson, born San Francisco, 1897. Nelson maintained from the moment of his arrest through the entirety of his trial that he had not been responsible for any of the crimes charged against him. He said so to officers at Rupert Street. He told the Manitoba Free Press directly that he had been charged with 2 offenses, but was not the person responsible. He sat through the proceedings with a quiet, composed bearing, showing no distress when witnesses identified him, no reaction when physical evidence was described and connected to him. Jail staff noted that he had become absorbed in a passage from the Book of Proverbs, reading it repeatedly from morning until lights were taken away each night. A passage describing the dangers of a strange woman to an unwary man. Even confined and facing the evidence of 22 deaths, he was still filtering his reality through the scripture his grandmother had instilled in him from infancy. In his own framing, he was not a man who had preyed on vulnerable women. He was a man who had been endangered by them. The defense argued that his documented brain injury, his history of psychotic episodes, and his institutional record at Napa should qualify the judgment against him. The Canadian court was not persuaded. The evidence was too thorough and too physically unambiguous. The jury deliberated for 48 minutes. They returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Judge Andrew Dysart sentenced Earl Leonard Nelson to death by hanging. Nelson sat through the sentencing without visible reaction. He did not speak. He did not change expression. The speed of the deliberation, 48 minutes for a case spanning 22, confirmed deaths across 2 countries and 16 months, reflected how thoroughly the evidence had done its work. There was no ambiguity in the physical record. There was no meaningful gap in the chain connecting Nelson to the crimes. The jury had not needed extended debate because the case presented to them had not left room for it. Outside the courtroom, the city of Winnipeg had been watching the proceedings closely. 2 of the victims had been local women. Lola Cowan's family had attended hearings. William Patterson, who had found his wife beneath their bed just months earlier, had given testimony that the courtroom heard in complete silence. The public gallery had been full throughout. When the verdict was announced, there was no celebration. Only a quiet, collective exhale from a city that had been holding its breath since June. Justice, when it arrived without fanfare. It simply arrived. Nelson received the judgment of the court in the same composed silence with which he had conducted himself throughout, performing, to the very end, the role of a man to whom none of this had anything to do with him. Nelson spent approximately 2 months on death row at Vaughan Street Jail. He did not confess. He did not speak to investigators about the full scope of the crimes. He continued to read scripture and continued to tell anyone who engaged him that he was an innocent man wrongly convicted. In the days before his execution, he agreed to meet with the families of 2 of his victims. One was Lola Cowan's mother. She traveled to the jail and sat across from the man who had taken her 14-year-old daughter on a June afternoon when Lola had been out selling flowers to help her sick father. Nelson told her it had all been a terrible mistake. He told her he had not done it. He expressed condolences in the way a stranger might mourn a tragedy was not connected to. He offered nothing that resembled the truth. He was not capable of it, or not willing to provide it. By that point, the distinction barely mattered. The execution was set for Friday, January 13th, 1928. Nelson was 30 years old. The sentence was carried out at Vaughan Street Jail. Police officers were present. Journalists attended. Family members of victims who had made the journey to Winnipeg stood in the room to see it through to the end. Nelson was escorted to the place of execution. The officials intended the execution to be swift. The executioner asked if he had any final words. Nelson looked out at the room, at the officers, at the journalists, at the families who had come. He said, "I forgive those who have wronged me." Not a confession, not an acknowledgement of even one name among the 22 women whose lives he had ended. Not a word about Clara Newman, who had shown him around her boarding house in good faith. Not a word about Lola Cowan, who had been 14 and selling flowers. Not a word about Emily Patterson, whose husband had prayed on his knees beside their bed. Only the presentation, one final time, of a decent, wronged, forgiving man. The same presentation he had been making since the day he first knocked on a door and smiled and waited to be invited in. The drop did not go as planned. The rope did not achieve the clean break the executioner had prepared for. The contemporary accounts reported that the execution was prolonged. It is also a fraction of what any of the women he had harmed experienced before he took everything from them. When investigators completed their cross-referencing after Nelson's execution, the confirmed total stood at 22 deaths across 16 months. The geography covered California, Oregon, Washington State, Iowa, Missouri, Pennsylvania, New York, Michigan, and Manitoba, Canada. At least 5 additional cases, women found in cities Nelson had passed through, in circumstances precisely matching his method, were examined as possibly connected to him, though formal confirmation was not established in every instance. His record stood as the most extensive connected series of crimes in North American history at that time, a record that would not be surpassed for decades. Every confirmed victim had one thing in common. Each had advertised a room for rent or had one visibly available. Not one was approached at random or targeted on the street. The entire mechanism relied on a social contract. The idea that a woman offering a room could trust the stranger who responded. He exploited that contract 22 times, across 2 countries, because nothing about his appearance or manner suggested he would. The 16 months during which Nelson traveled freely exposed institutional failures with real consequences. The most significant was the complete absence of any system for sharing information about crimes across state and international borders. Each city treated its case as local. Each investigation started from zero. No one had what would have been needed to surface the pattern while it could still save lives. Napa State Hospital's repeated failures to maintain custody, and its final decision to discharge Nelson in absentia rather than continue the effort, placed a man documented as dangerous back into a city full of the people he would harm. No public warning was issued. No notification went to law enforcement. In the years following Nelson's execution, American and Canadian law enforcement agencies began building the cross-jurisdictional communication frameworks that are now standard practice. Those frameworks were built, in part, on the specific lessons of what had gone wrong during 16 months of isolation between jurisdictions that were all, unknowingly, working the same case. Clara Newman, 60, San Francisco. Laura Beale, 63, San Jose. Lillian St. Mary, San Francisco. Ollie Russell, Santa Barbara. Mary Nisbet, Oakland. Isabel Gallegos, Stockton. Beata Withers, Portland. Virginia Grant, Portland. Mabel Fluke, Portland. Marion Corcoran, San Francisco. Hannah Edmonds, San Francisco. Florence Monks, Seattle. Blanche Myers, San Francisco. Almira Bard, Council Bluffs. Bonnie Pace, Kansas City. Mary McConnell, Philadelphia; Fannie Mae and Geneva Forbes, Detroit; Lola Cowan, 14, Winnipeg; Emily Patterson, Winnipeg. Each of these women had a life that existed entirely outside the context of Earl Nelson. They had families who carried what happened to them long after the newspapers moved on to the next story. Their names belong in the record. They are there not as footnotes, but as the actual center of what this case was about. The people it cost everything, while the man responsible walked out through front doors that had been opened to him in trust. Earl Nelson was a product of compounding circumstances: parental loss in infancy, an austere and isolated upbringing, a catastrophic brain injury in childhood, and an institutional system that documented his danger and then released him anyway. None of these circumstances created any obligation to excuse what he did. 22 people lost their lives. The causes of his behavior explain without forgiving. What made him distinctive from a historical standpoint was not only the scale of the crimes, but the method. He never forced his way in. He never threatened. He knocked on doors and smiled and waited to be invited in. And it worked 22 times because he had spent his entire life learning to present himself as someone trustworthy. He was the first individual in North American history identified as what later criminologists would define as an offender responsible for a connected series of crimes spanning multiple jurisdictions over an extended period. He knocked on the door. They answered. And the world that followed, investigators, courts, lawmakers, had to reckon with exactly what that meant. The gorilla killer's story is a reminder that the most serious dangers do not always look dangerous. They arrive politely, carry a Bible, and wait to be trusted before they act. If this case stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, because awareness of how these situations develop is the most practical form of protection there is. Subscribe to this channel to stay informed about the true cases that shaped how we investigate, prosecute, and work to prevent harm in the modern world. Stay alert, verify who you allow into your home, and take seriously the instinct that something may not be right, even when the person in front of you seems entirely reasonable.